Let me just add, by the way, that with Marx, his sort of concern or philosophy is referred to as historic materialism. So, from Marx's perspective, he saw human society as something that was in the process of evolving or developing. Contrast Marx's perspective from that of Max Weber. Now, although you see in the text that this gentleman's last name is spelled Weber, it's pronounced Weber, that in German W is pronounced as V and vice versa. So I suppose if there's something that you'll end up remembering out of these lectures, it's to pronounce this gentleman's name differently. Sometimes Weber is held out as a contrast to Marx because of his emphasis on ideas. And so the idea behind it is that Weber looked to other forces besides economy as shaping human society. He felt that culture and politics played an important role. And so his approach was called interpretive sociology. So where Marx focused on history, Weber focused on ideas. His understanding and his perspective was captured by the concept called Wertschen, and it's spelled in your text Vertschen, understanding. So from Weber's perspective, there was a way in which sociology could lend itself to a greater understanding of how a society worked. Of the big three, the last of the bunch is Emil Durkheim. Like his German colleagues, he was focusing on some of the same ideas. His perspective, though, is characterized as positivist sociology. So we saw earlier with Comte that positivism had to do with the belief that there were rules or laws about how things worked, and part of that belief was rooted in an understanding of how nature worked. So Durkheim also believed that, but from his perspective, he looked at the way in which labor was divided in a particular society. And from that, he was able to suggest that the degree to which you see the distribution of labor might indicate something about the societal coherence. Following Durkheim, at least in our text, is Georges Simmel, who is generally credited as someone who has created formal sociology. If you will, the formality here has to do with numbers or number crunching. We'll see in the next chapter that talks about methods that if there's a value to the soft science, it is in its ability to generate the kinds of numbers that might accurately say something about human behavior. So in that respect, you could end up saying that Simmel is bringing sociology back to the roots shared with a hard science by looking to quantify the experiences and then to be able to use certain statistical tests to be able to test out the validity of those numbers and what they end up meaning. Besides those individuals, you also saw other individuals, especially in this country. For example, in association with the University of Chicago, you saw the development of the so-called Chicago School. Much like with Simmel's perspective, the Chicago School tended to emphasize empirical research. There was an understanding or a concern over the influences of social and physical environments. Several important studies come out of the Chicago School. For example, one study that was done, I believe, in the 1920s, noticed that there was a distribution of immigrants in Chicago. Now, Chicago, as you may know, is situated on a lake, but nonetheless, there's enough land around it that sociologists were able to look at the distribution of people in concentric circles radiating out from Chicago. And from that, they were able to infer something about the quality of the housing stock that was there and the success of the people who lived in the different rings. Simply, as immigrants came to Chicago, they would start at the center, and then as they acquired more capital, would move out to what we would call today the suburbs, because they would have the means to be able to purchase better, more comfortable living arrangements. So the housing stock close to the center of the city was pretty bad. But as each wave of immigrants successfully assimilated or found in some other way a toehold for them to be able to maintain themselves, they were able to acquire monies that they could then that could allow them then to move into better quality properties as renters, or further out to be able to buy property. So the Chicago School brought a level of empiricism, looking at hard facts, that benefited sociology and helped to establish its bona fides as a true science. One of Massachusetts' own plays a role in sociology. This is W.E.B. Du Bois. What Du Bois did was, at the beginning of the 20th century, start to look at the concept of race. Race, of course, is a societal construct. There's not anything intrinsic to it. Biological differences may exist, but it's not like race means that we have people of different subspecies. What Du Bois noticed was that for some who would identify then as black or Negro, you would end up seeing a double consciousness. That is, besides their own sort of consciousness, looking out for their own interests, they also were constantly aware of their role in a larger society. If you will, they had to exert more energy and have to be on greater guard that that in the exercise of their double consciousness, they did not give offense to anyone. Although we see these institutions and individuals playing certain kinds of roles, it didn't stop when it came down to looking to variations on different forms of sociology. And since this is an intro course, we can talk about a few of those particular forms with an understanding that even as we talk about them, they're probably topics that would be better served as something of an entire course in its own right. So for example, when we look at the historical materialism of Karl Marx, what we're really seeing is one of the big major theories of sociology, so-called conflict theory. And while Marx was looking at that from the perspective of economics, conflict theory is a little broader, talking about any situation where there is some kind of a power imbalance. It doesn't only have to be money. So when you look at something like feminist theory, which is generally viewed as a conflict theory, there's not necessarily money that's the primary difference there. Rather, it's a consideration of how society views gender and treats individuals differently based on gender. Partly feminist theory arose out of the growing social consciousness of the 1960s and 1970s from the women's movement, and incorporated some of the Marxist concerns about questioning why certain individuals have power, looking to the idea that they will use that power to consolidate their grip and to improve their particular position, and finally to use the political process as a way to potentially pry away some of that power or distribute it more equally around a society. Where I've talked about conflict theory as one of the big three, that is to say, one of the major theories in sociology, the second of that big three would be symbolic interactionism. The idea behind it had to do with the ways in which we see individuals interacting with one another, not so much just as individuals, but ways in which they played or performed certain kinds of roles. And in that respect, what was interesting was to look at the nature of the roles. Associated with symbolic constructionism is the concept of something being macrosocial, which looks at the larger scale, and microsociological, which looks at more face-to-face interactions and tries to derive or to study what that says about symbology. The researcher associated with symbolic interactionism was Irving Goffman, who talks about a dramaturgical theory of social interaction. Dramaturgical basically says that it's as if people are working off of certain kinds of scripts, And so they are not speaking so much of themselves, but are acting out in some kind of a, if you will, a drama. Of other sociological theories, you could look at something like postmodernism, which ends up talking about the ways in which meaning may be shared or may not be shared. So where symbolic interactionism looks at transactions, either in a society or on the lower level of face-to-face interactions, postmodernism seems to suggest that there is a fraying or a growing disagreement on the nature of the power or the symbology that is occurring in these kinds of relationships. Included in that batch of theories, you'll also see something called mid-range theory. What you end up seeing is a way in which theories have a certain currency almost, and that there is a cycle to them where theories would end up going back or forth. The idea of mid-range theory, therefore, hopes to capture the sense of the average between the extremes, or where ideally you'd find a midpoint between those extremes.